Nothing breaks a parent's heart more than feeling forced to abandon their own child. But sometimes, the cruelest betrayals come from those we trust most to protect us. In ancient Norway, Chieftain Erik threw his daughter Brynja from a cliff, hoping her death would hide his shameful secret. The little girl should have died on those rocks below. Instead, a fierce warrior named Halvar found her barely breathing. This giant berserker, known for his deadly skills in battle, made an unexpected choice. He saved her life and raised her as his own. For years they lived in the wilderness together. He taught her how to fight, how to survive, and how to never give up. Now Brynja has grown strong, and she's ready to face the father who tried to kill her. What dark secret made a father choose murder over love? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the breath of sleeping gods, and in the great hall of Chieftain Erik Ironhand, the fire burned low in its stone hearth. The carved wooden beams overhead bore the weight of generations, their surfaces blackened by decades of smoke and marked with the runes of ancestors who had ruled these harsh northern lands since memory began. This was Raven's Hollow, a settlement carved from stone and stubborn will, where the crash of waves against cliff faces had become as familiar as heartbeats to those who called it home. Erik sat in his high-backed chair, fingers drumming against the worn armrest where his father's hands had once rested, and his father's father before that. The weight of leadership had settled on his shoulders like winter frost, persistent, cold, and impossible to shake. At 43, his beard had begun to show threads of silver, and the lines around his eyes spoke of decisions that had carved themselves into his very bones. Yet for all his authority, for all the respect his name commanded across the 9 settlements of the Northern Territories, there remained one burden that threatened to crush him beneath its weight. The carved runestone sat hidden beneath the loose floorboard behind his chair, wrapped in oiled leather and buried like a shameful corpse. The father's shame stone, as he had come to think of it in the dark hours when sleep fled from his troubled mind. Upon its surface, ancient symbols told a story that could destroy not just his reign, but his very bloodline. The secret it held was darker than the winter nights, more dangerous than the serpents that legends claimed dwelt in the deepest parts of the fjord. "Father," came a voice from the doorway, soft as spring rain, yet carrying within it all the gentle strength that had once filled Erik's heart with such conflicted pride and terror. Brynja stepped into the hall, her small feet silent on the stone floor. At 8 years old, she possessed an unusual stillness for a child, as if she understood instinctively that her very existence walked a knife's edge. Her hair fell in waves of auburn that caught the firelight like burnished copper, and her eyes, those damning, beautiful eyes, held depths that seemed far too ancient for her young face. She wore a simple woolen dress, dyed the deep blue of winter midnight, and around her neck hung a pendant carved from whalebone, a protective charm her mother had pressed into Erik's hands on her deathbed. "What is it, little star?" Erik's voice carried warmth despite the storm clouds gathering in his thoughts. The endearment came naturally, a remnant of better days, when he could look upon his daughter without feeling the weight of destiny pressing down upon them both. "Astrid says the fishing boats are returning early. She thinks a storm is coming." Brynja's words were measured, careful. Even at her tender age, she had learned to read the moods that shifted across her father's face, like shadows on water. Erik nodded, though his attention remained divided between his daughter's presence and the hidden stone that seemed to pulse beneath the floor like a buried heartbeat. "Astrid is wise in the ways of weather. Tell the men to secure the boats well above the tide line." Brynja hesitated at the threshold, her small hands clasped before her. "Father, why do the other children whisper when I pass?" The question struck Erik like a blade between the ribs. He had hoped she was still too young to notice, too innocent to understand the weight of suspicious glances and hushed conversations that followed in her wake. But children possessed a keen awareness for the currents of adult emotion, And Brynja had always been perceptive beyond her years. People sometimes fear what they do not understand, Erik said finally, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. You are different, Brynja, special, and that can frighten those who prefer the familiar. It was both truth and lie woven together, the kind of careful deception that had become Erik's daily bread since the night of her birth. She was indeed special, marked by gifts that ran in bloodlines far older and more dangerous than the simple Norse heritage most assumed. But her difference was not merely unusual, it was forbidden, tied to powers that the Christian priests who had begun to arrive in their lands would call demonic, and that even the old believers viewed with a mixture of awe and terror. Will I always be different? She asked, and the vulnerability in her voice nearly shattered what remained of Erik's resolve. Yes, he said, because lies had never come easily to him, even when truth cut deeper than any sword. But different does not mean wrong, little star. Remember that. Brynja nodded solemnly and withdrew, leaving Erik alone with his ghosts and his growing certainty that the day of reckoning drew ever closer. Through the narrow window, he could see the storm clouds gathering on the horizon, dark and heavy with the promise of chaos. How fitting that nature itself seemed to mirror the tempest building in his own heart. The great hall felt too small suddenly, its walls pressing in like a tomb. Erik rose from his chair and moved to the window, gazing out at the settlement he had sworn to protect. Smoke rose from the chimneys of the longhouses scattered across the hillside, each one home to families who looked to him for leadership, for protection, for the steady hand that would guide them through whatever hardships the gods might send. How could he tell them that their greatest threat might come not from raiders or storms or failed harvests, but from the very blood that ran in his daughter's veins? The settlement of Ravenshollow had been built on a foundation of pragmatic survival. Here, among the harsh beauty of the northern fjords, every decision carried weight, every choice rippled outward to affect the lives of all who sheltered beneath Erik's protection. The longhouses stood sturdy and low, built to withstand the fierce winds that swept down from the mountains. Gardens of hardy vegetables clustered near each home, tended by women whose hands knew the secrets of coaxing life from reluctant soil. Children played between the buildings, their laughter a bright counterpoint to the serious business of daily survival. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, Erik could sense the growing unease. Conversations that stopped when he approached, glances that lingered too long on Brynja when she walked through the settlement, the way mothers pulled their own children closer when his daughter passed, as if her very presence might somehow contaminate their offspring with whatever strangeness marked her as different. He had tried to shield her from the worst of it, surrounding her with loyal retainers who understood the value of discretion. Chief among these was Astrid, the settlement's wise woman, whose knowledge of herbs and healing had saved countless lives over the years. Astrid had served as midwife at Brynja's birth, had been present for the moment when Erik first understood the true scope of what his daughter's existence would mean. If anyone could be trusted with the weight of their secret, it was Astrid. The woman in question appeared in the doorway, as if summoned by his thoughts, her weathered face grave with concern. "Erik, we need to speak." He turned from the window, noting the careful way she glanced around the hall before entering fully. Astrid was a woman of perhaps 50 winters, her grey hair braided with the bone charms that marked her station. Her eyes held the deep wisdom of one who had seen enough of life to understand its shadows as well as its light. "The boats?" Erik asked, though he suspected this conversation would venture into far more treacherous waters than mere weather. "Secured. But that's not why I'm here." Astrid moved closer, lowering her voice to barely above a whisper. "Word has come from the southern settlements. The Christian priests grow bolder. They speak openly now of purging the old bloodlines, of cleansing the land of what they call unholy influences." Erik's blood chilled. The arrival of Christianity in their lands had brought with it many changes, some beneficial, new trade routes, new knowledge, but also new fears and prejudices that threatened the delicate balance their people had maintained with the older powers for countless generations. "How long before they reach our territory?" he asked. "Perhaps a season, maybe two." "But Erik—" Astrid's hand found his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "There are others closer than the priests. Harald Bloodaxe has been asking questions about Brynja, about her mother's lineage." Harald Bloodaxe ruled the largest settlement to their east, a man whose ambition was matched only by his cruelty. If Harald had begun to suspect the truth about Brynja's heritage, then the danger had moved far closer to home than any distant priests. "What kind of questions?" Erik's voice carried the edge of steel that had once struck fear into the hearts of enemies on distant battlefields. "He wants to know why you've never remarried, why you keep your daughter so sheltered. There are whispers that he's planning to unite the settlements under his rule, and those who oppose him." Astrid's words trailed off, but the implication hung heavy in the air between them. Erik understood. In Harald's vision of a unified territory, there would be no room for secrets, no tolerance for bloodlines that carried the old powers. Men like Harald saw such gifts not as blessings from the ancient gods, but as threats to their authority, complications that needed to be eliminated for the sake of what they called progress. "He cannot be allowed to succeed," Erik said. Though even as he spoke the words, he wondered what price he would be willing to pay to ensure his daughter's safety. "There may be another way," Astrid said carefully. "If Brynja were to disappear, if some accident were to befall her, then Harald's interest would die with her. The bloodline would be broken, the threat ended." The suggestion struck Erik like a physical blow. For a moment he could not breathe, could not think beyond the horrific implications of what Astrid was proposing. That she would even voice such a thing spoke to the desperation of their situation. The impossible choices that had begun to close around them like a noose. "You ask me to murder my own child," he said, his voice rough with barely contained emotion. "I ask you to consider the lives of everyone in this settlement," Astrid replied, her tone gentle but implacable. "How many will die if Harald decides we harbor forbidden bloodlines? How many children will suffer for the sake of preserving one? The terrible arithmetic of leadership, the cold calculation that weighed individual lives against the greater good." Erik had made such choices before on distant battlefields, but never had the scales held someone so precious, so irreplaceable. The weight of those potential deaths pressed down upon him, each imagined face a stone added to the burden he already carried. "There must be another way," he said. But the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Astrid's expression softened with something approaching pity. "Perhaps, but time grows short, and Harald's patience grows thin. Whatever you decide, it must be soon." She withdrew, leaving Erik alone with the echoes of her words and the terrible certainty that his world was about to change forever. Outside, the first fat drops of rain began to strike the window, and in the distance thunder rumbled like the anger of sleeping gods awakening to a world that had forgotten their names. The father's shamestone seemed to pulse beneath the floorboards, and Erik found himself wondering if the ancestors whose runes marked its surface had ever faced such impossible choices. In the legends, heroes always found a way to save everyone, to emerge victorious with honor intact and loved ones safe. But legends, Erik had learned, were poor guides for the harsh realities of actual life, where sometimes the only choices available were between different shades of damnation. That night, as the storm raged outside and his daughter slept peacefully in her chamber, Erik sat beside the hidden stone and tried to find the courage to do what his duty demanded, even if it meant sacrificing the one thing in his life that still held, meaning the storm that had threatened all evening, finally broke with the fury of the gods themselves. Rain lashed against the shuttered windows of the great hall, and wind howled through the settlement like the voices of the restless dead. Erik stood before the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker as if they too were unsettled by the tempest raging outside. It was past the midnight hour when the messenger arrived. The young man burst through the doors of the hall, his cloak streaming with rainwater and his face pale with exhaustion. Erik recognized him as Gunnar, one of Harald Bloodaxe's sworn men, a fact that sent ice through his veins even before the messenger spoke a single word. "Chieftain Erik," Gunnar gasped, dropping to one knee as protocol demanded. "I bring word from Harald Bloodaxe, ruler of the eastern settlements." Erik's hand instinctively moved to the hilt of his sword, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. "Speak your message." Gunnar rose, water still dripping from his sodden clothes. "My Lord Harald extends his greetings and his concern for your welfare. He has heard troubling rumors about unnatural occurrences in your territory, signs that the old bloodlines still taint these lands. He offers his assistance in cleansing whatever corruption may have taken root here." The words were carefully chosen, diplomatically phrased, but Erik heard the threat beneath their surface as clearly as if Harald had drawn a blade. This was no offer of help. It was a demand for submission wrapped in the pretense of neighborly concern. "Tell your lord that Ravenshollow has no need of cleansing," Erik replied, his voice carrying the authority of generations of chieftains. "We honor the old ways while respecting the new. There is no corruption here." Gunnar's eyes flicked toward the stairs that led to the upper chambers, where Brynja slept peacefully, unaware that her very existence had become the center of a deadly game. "My Lord Harald believes otherwise. He has sources of information that suggest certain bloodlines, thought extinct, still survive in your household." The pretense crumbled away, like a dam breaking under pressure. Erik stepped forward, and in that moment, the messenger saw not the diplomatic chieftain, but the warrior who had once carved his name in blood across distant battlefields. "Are you accusing me of harboring forbidden bloodlines in my own home?" Erik's voice was deadly quiet, the kind of calm that preceded violence. "I accuse no one," Gunnar said quickly, taking a step back. "I merely convey my lord's concerns. He wishes to send a delegation to examine your settlement to ensure that all is as it should be." Surely a loyal chieftain would welcome such scrutiny. Erik understood the trap that was being laid. To refuse would be to admit guilt in Harald's eyes, providing justification for whatever action he chose to take. To accept would be to allow enemies into his stronghold, to expose Brynja to examination by those who would see her gifts as proof of her corrupt nature. "When does your lord propose this examination?" Erik asked. "He will arrive with the next full moon. 3 days hence." Gunnar's relief at delivering the message was palpable. "He expects your full cooperation in this matter." After the messenger departed, vanishing back into the storm as quickly as he had appeared, Erik stood alone in his hall and felt the weight of inevitability settling around him like a burial shroud. 3 days. In 3 days, Harald would arrive with his retinue of warriors and his priests, and his burning certainty that the old bloodlines were a poison that needed to be purged from the land. Erik climbed the stairs to Brynja's chamber, moving with the careful silence of a hunter. The door was carved with protective runes, wards against evil that he had commissioned from the finest craftsmen, though he wondered now if they would prove sufficient against the evil that approached from within their own people. Brynja lay sleeping beneath furs and woolen blankets, her face peaceful in the way that only children could achieve. Her auburn hair spread across the pillow like spilled copper, and in the dim light of the oil lamp, she looked so small, so fragile, so utterly innocent of the forces that conspired against her. Erik knelt beside her bed, watching the gentle rise and fall of her breathing. How could something so pure, so perfect, be seen as a threat worthy of death? But he knew the answer, had always known it. Fear made monsters of ordinary men, and power made those monsters dangerous. As if sensing his presence, Brynja stirred in her sleep. Her eyes opened slowly, focusing on her father's face with the trust that only a child could possess. "Papa, is everything well?" The simple question nearly broke him. Here she was, this precious child, who looked to him for protection and guidance, and he was contemplating. "Everything is well, little star," he lied, his voice surprisingly steady. "Go back to sleep. The storm will pass." But even as she settled back into slumber, Erik knew that some storms left nothing unchanged in their wake. He rose from beside her bed and made his way back to the great hall, his steps heavy with the weight of the decision that could no longer be delayed. The father's shamestone called to him from its hiding place, and this time Erik answered. He pried up the loose floorboard and withdrew the oiled leather bundle, unwrapping it with hands that trembled despite his efforts to remain steady. The runestone was smaller than a man's hand, but heavy with more than mere weight. Its surface bore the ancient symbols that told a story stretching back through generations, a story of power and bloodline and the terrible price of keeping such secrets. Erik had memorized every line, every curve of the runes, but tonight they seemed to burn with their own inner light. The stone spoke of Brynja's true heritage, of the gifts that flowed in her veins like liquid fire. It named her as the last of a bloodline that stretched back to the earliest days, when the barriers between the mortal world and the realm of the gods were thin and permeable. She was what the old believers called a bridge walker, one who could step between worlds, who could speak with the dead and command the elements themselves. In the old days, such gifts would have made her a treasure beyond price, a blessing from the gods themselves. But these were not the old days. The world had grown smaller, more fearful, more suspicious of anything that could not be easily understood or controlled. Men like Harald saw power as something to be hoarded by those strong enough to seize it, not shared with those born to it through blood and blessing. Erik traced the runes with his fingertip, feeling their raised edges like scars upon the stone. The final symbol, the one that had haunted his dreams for 8 years, was the mark of prophecy. It spoke of a choice that would come to the bloodline's guardian, a decision that would determine not just the fate of the bridgewalker, but the fate of all who shared the old blood. The prophecy was maddeningly vague, as such things always were, but its meaning had become clearer with each passing year. Erik was the guardian, Brynja was the bridgewalker, and the choice was whether to preserve the bloodline by sacrificing the child, or to preserve the child and risk the bloodline's complete destruction at the hands of those who feared what they could not control. Thunder crashed overhead, shaking the very foundations of the hall, and Erik made his decision. He rewrapped the stone and returned it to its hiding place, but its weight remained with him as he prepared for what must come. By morning, he would need to gather supplies, to choose the path that would lead to the sacred cliffs where the gods were said to dwell closest to the mortal world. By tomorrow's end, the choice would be made. The deed would be done, and the terrible arithmetic of leadership would claim its price. Erik Ironhand, chieftain of Raven's Hollow, sat in his chair and waited for dawn, knowing that when it came, he would begin the hardest day of his life, the day he would save his people by destroying the one thing that made his life worth living. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the great hall, a deeper tempest had finally found its center. In 3 days, Harald would come seeking proof of corruption. He would find only a grieving father and a bloodline ended forever, if Erik could find the strength to see it through. Dawn broke grey and reluctant over Raven's Hollow, the storm having exhausted itself during the long night. Erik had not slept, but had instead spent the dark hours pacing the length of his hall like a caged wolf, wrestling with thoughts that offered no comfort and decisions that promised only pain. The settlement stirred to life with its usual rhythms, smoke rising from cooking fires, the lowing of cattle being led to pasture, the sound of children's voices carrying on the morning air. To an outside observer, nothing would seem amiss. But Erik felt the weight of the charade pressing down upon him with each normal moment that passed. Astrid arrived as the sun cleared the eastern peaks, her wise eyes immediately noting the haggard lines of exhaustion carved into Erik's face. She carried a leather satchel that clinked softly with the sound of glass vials, her healer's kit, though Erik suspected she had brought more than mere medicines. "You've made your choice," she said simply, settling into the chair across from his. "It was not a question. Harald comes in 3 days. He will find nothing to concern him." Erik's voice carried the hollow tone of a man who had already begun to mourn. "The bloodline will die with her, Astrid nodded slowly, her weathered hands folding in her lap. It is the choice any father would make to protect his people. But Erik, are you certain you can see it through? Once begun, this path allows no turning back. I know. The words tasted like ashes. Tell me what must be done. From her satchel, Astrid withdrew a small vial filled with a clear liquid that caught the morning light like captured starshine. This will bring peaceful sleep, no pain, no fear. She will simply drift away as if falling into the deepest of dreams. Erik stared at the vial, this small thing that contained such immense power over life and death. How long? Moments only. And Erik, Astrid leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. It must appear accidental. A fall from the sacred cliffs while gathering flowers, perhaps. The gods will understand the necessity, but Harald must see only tragedy. The sacred cliffs, of course. It was fitting, in a way, that the place where their people had worshipped for countless generations should be where this bloodline finally ended. Erik had walked those paths as a boy, had marveled at the sheer drop to the rocks and churning waters below. No one could survive such a fall, which was precisely why it would serve their purpose. When? Erik asked. Today, this afternoon when the sun is high and the paths are dry. I will suggest that Brynja might enjoy gathering the early spring flowers that bloom near the cliff edges. A father indulging his daughter's simple pleasure. Astrid's voice remained steady, but Erik caught the slight tremor in her hands as she replaced the vial in her satchel. A commotion outside drew their attention, voices raised in excitement and the sound of running feet. Through the window, Erik could see several of the settlement's children racing toward the harbor, their faces bright with anticipation. The ships are returning, Astrid observed. The ones that rode out the storm in the southern coves. Erik rose and moved to the window, watching as the first of the fishing vessels rounded the rocky point that protected their harbor. The boats rode low in the water, their holds heavy with the catch that would feed the settlement through the next several days. Normal life continuing its course, oblivious to the tragedy that would soon unfold. Papa. Brynja's voice came from the doorway, sweet and curious as always. She had dressed herself in her favorite blue dress and bound her hair back with a ribbon of yellow silk, a gift from a trader who had visited the previous summer. Astrid, good morning? Good morning, little one, Astrid replied, her smile warm despite the darkness of their earlier conversation. I was just telling your father that the early flowers should be blooming on the cliff paths. Purple starflowers and golden windwells, perfect for making garlands. Brynja's eyes lit up with the innocent delight that Erik had come to treasure above all else. May I go and gather some? I promised to stay on the safe paths. The irony of her words struck Erik like a physical blow. Safe paths. As if any path could be safe for her now. As if safety were something that could still be promised or preserved. I think that would be lovely, Erik managed, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his chest. But you must wait until the afternoon sun has dried the paths properly. The rocks will be slippery from last night's rain. Of course, Papa, I'll be very careful. She paused at the threshold, tilting her head in that thoughtful way she had inherited from her mother. Will you come with me? We could make garlands together, like we used to when I was small. The request nearly shattered what remained of Erik's resolve. How many afternoons had they spent together on those very cliffs, she chattering about the flowers and the birds, while he pointed out the shapes of distant islands? How many times had she trusted him completely to keep her safe, while they walked the narrow paths together? Erik's voice caught and he forced himself to start again. I have matters to attend to this afternoon, little star, but Astrid will accompany you. She knows the best spots for finding the prettiest flowers. Astrid nodded agreement, her expression giving away nothing of their true purpose. I would be delighted to spend the afternoon with you, child. We'll find flowers enough to decorate the entire hall. Brynja beamed and scampered away to break her fast, leaving the two adults alone with their conspiracy of necessity. Erik sank back into his chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 43 years weighing upon his shoulders. The stories say that the old gods could see the future, he said quietly, that they knew the choices their children would be forced to make. I wonder if they would approve of this. The gods understand sacrifice, Astrid replied. They gave up much to create this world, and they ask no less of those who would preserve it. Brynja's death will save not just our settlement, but every person of the old blood who still draws breath in these lands. Erik wanted to find comfort in her words, to believe that the arithmetic of salvation could somehow balance the weight of what they planned to do. But all he could think of was the trust in Brynja's eyes, the way she had looked to him for protection and guidance every day of her young life. "There is one other matter," Astrid said, her voice carefully neutral. "The body. It must be found, but not immediately. Time enough for the medicine to fade from her blood, for the truth to become impossible to discern." Erik closed his eyes, trying to shut out the image of his daughter broken on the rocks below the sacred cliffs. "I will find her. A father searching desperately for his missing child. No one will question my presence there. Yes. And Erik, when Harald arrives, your grief must be absolute. He must see a man destroyed by loss, not a chieftain who has made a calculated sacrifice." "That will not be difficult," Erik said, and knew the words for truth. Whatever he did this day, whatever necessity drove him to this choice, the grief would be real and lasting. He was about to murder the only light in his world, and no amount of justification would ever dim the darkness that would follow. Outside, the children of Ravenshollow played in the morning sun, their laughter carrying on the spring breeze. Somewhere among them, Brynja was breaking her fast and planning her afternoon of flower gathering, trusting completely in the Father who had already decided how her story would end. The afternoon sun climbed toward its zenith, painting the fjord in shades of silver and blue that should have filled Erik's heart with the familiar peace of his homeland's beauty. Instead, each moment that passed felt like a stone added to the crushing weight in his chest. He stood at the window of his hall, watching the settlement go about its daily business, while he prepared to commit the most unthinkable act of his life. Brynja had spent the morning hours helping in the kitchens, her bright chatter filling the spaces between the usual rhythms of meal preparation. Now she sat in the garden behind the hall, weaving stems of early grass into rough braids while she waited for the afternoon to ripen. Her patience was remarkable for a child her age, another sign of the otherworldly awareness that marked her bloodline, though she remained blissfully unaware of the forces that gift had set in motion. "The path to the sacred cliffs will be dry now," Astrid observed, joining Erik at the window. She had changed into her traveling clothes, sturdy boots and a woolen cloak that would serve well for an afternoon's walk along the rocky paths. In her hand, she carried a wicker basket for gathering flowers, the very picture of a grandmother indulging a child's simple pleasure. Erik nodded but could not trust his voice to speak. The weight of the poison vial seemed to burn against his chest where he had hidden it beneath his shirt, a small but terrible reminder of what the afternoon would bring. "Papa!" Brynja's voice rang clear across the garden as she spotted him at the window. "Look what I've made!" She held up her grass braids, woven together into a rough crown that sat charmingly askew on her auburn hair. "I thought I might make one with real flowers, the purple ones you told me about that grow near the cliffs." The innocence in her voice, the pure joy she took in such simple things, nearly broke Erik's resolve completely. How could he take that light from the world? How could he snuff out something so precious, so irreplaceable? But then his mind turned to Harald Bloodaxe and his approaching retinue, to the Christian priests, with their burning certainty that the old bloodlines were an abomination to be purged from the earth. He thought of the other children in the settlement, Gunnar's twin boys who raced their toy boats in the harbour, little Freydis who helped her mother tend the goats, all the innocent lives that would be forfeit if Harald decided that Ravenshollow harboured forbidden powers. "It's beautiful. Little star," Erik called down to her, his voice somehow steady despite the storm in his heart. "Save room in your basket for a proper crown." Brynja beamed and scampered to her feet, grass stains on her blue dress and dirt under her fingernails from her morning's play. She was completely, utterly, perfectly alive. And in a few hours, Erik turned away from the window, unable to watch her innocent preparations any longer. "The men are asking about the fishing schedules for next week," came a voice from the doorway. Olaf, Erik's second in command, stood waiting with the patient demeanor of a man accustomed to his chieftain's moods. "Shall I tell them to prepare the nets for the deep water grounds?" The question of fishing schedules, such a normal concern, such an ordinary part of leadership that required his attention. Erik almost laughed at the bitter irony of it. Here he was, planning the murder of his own daughter, and life expected him to continue making decisions about nets and fishing grounds as if the world had not already ended. "Yes," Erik managed. "Tell them to prepare for deep water. The weather should hold clear for the next several days." Olaf nodded and turned to go, then paused. "Chieftain, are you well? You look—" "I am well enough," Erik cut him off. "Attend to the fishing schedules." After Olaf departed, Erik found himself alone with Astrid and the terrible weight of what they were about to do. The wise woman had settled into a chair and was checking the contents of her flower-gathering basket. But Erik could see the tension in the set of her shoulders, the careful way she avoided meeting his eyes directly. "Once it is done," Erik said quietly, "how do we live with ourselves?" Astrid's hands stilled on the basket. "We remember that love sometimes demands the hardest choices, that a father's first duty is to protect his child, even when protection means—" She stopped, unable to finish the thought. "Even when protection means becoming the danger himself," Erik completed. "Yes, I understand the logic, but understanding and accepting are different things entirely. The alternative is to watch her burn," Astrid said, her voice hard with the kind of pragmatic truth that made her such a valued advisor. "Harald will not be satisfied with exile or imprisonment. The priests he travels with have their own ideas about how to deal with forbidden bloodlines. They call it purification through fire." The image struck Erik like a physical blow. Brynja's small form consumed by flames, while zealous men pronounced her cleansed of sin. At least their way would be quick, merciful. At least she would never know fear or pain or betrayal. Small comforts, but in a situation devoid of good choices. Erik found himself clinging to whatever fragments of mercy he could salvage from the wreckage of his world. "Are you ready, Astrid?" Brynja's voice carried from the garden, bright with anticipation. "The sun is perfect now, and I can see the flower meadows from here." Erik closed his eyes and tried to memorize the sound of her happiness, knowing it would be the last time he would ever hear such pure joy in her voice. When he opened them again, Astrid was watching him with something approaching pity. "It's time," she said simply. Erik nodded and moved toward the door, each step feeling like he was walking through deep water. The poison vial pressed against his chest, its weight somehow both insignificant and overwhelming. In his mind, he rehearsed the sequence of events that would unfold over the next few hours. The walk to the cliffs, the moment when he would give her the poisoned water, the terrible wait as the drug took effect, and finally the push that would send her small body tumbling toward the rocks below. But first, he had to face his daughter's trusting smile and pretend that he was still the father she believed him to be, the man who would protect her from any danger, who would never let harm come to her while breath remained in his body, the greatest lie he had ever told, and the most necessary. "Come then, little star," Erik called as he stepped into the garden where Brynja waited with her empty basket and her crown of woven grass. "Let us go and gather flowers worthy of a princess." She ran to him with arms outstretched, and Erik caught her up in an embrace that he tried to make last forever, knowing it would be among the last he would ever share with the child who had been the light of his world. The path to the sacred cliffs wound upward through stands of pine and birch, the new spring leaves creating a canopy of green that filtered the afternoon sunlight into dancing patterns on the rocky ground. Brynja skipped ahead with the boundless energy of childhood, her empty basket swinging from her arm as she pointed out the early wildflowers that dotted the hillside. "Look, Papa, the yellow ones are already blooming." She bent to examine a cluster of buttercups that had pushed through a crack in the stone, their petals bright as captured sunshine. "And there, do you see the purple ones growing near that fallen log?" Erik forced himself to respond with appropriate enthusiasm, though each word felt like swallowing broken glass. "Beautiful little star. We'll gather the best ones for your crown." Astrid walked beside him, her weathered face a mask of calm that revealed nothing of the terrible purpose that drove their afternoon expedition. The wicker basket on her arm might have contained any grandmother's collection of herbs and remedies, giving no hint of the poison that would soon serve its dark purpose. The path grew steeper as they climbed, and soon the sound of the settlement below faded into the whisper of wind through the trees. Here, in this place where generations of his people had come to commune with the gods, Erik felt the weight of ancestral judgment pressing down upon him. What would his father think of what he was about to do? What would his grandfather, who had first taught him the sacred stories of their bloodline, say about this betrayal of everything they had sworn to protect? "Tell me again about the old kings," Brynja said as they paused to rest on a moss-covered boulder. "The ones who could speak with ravens and walk between the worlds." The request struck Erik like a spear through the heart. Of all the stories she might have asked for, why this one? Why now, when he was leading her to her death precisely because she carried the blood of those legendary kings in her veins? "Why do you want to hear that old tale?" he asked, buying himself time to find his voice. "Because sometimes I dream about them," Brynja said simply, swinging her legs as she sat on the boulder. "I dream I'm walking through a forest that isn't quite real, and there are voices calling to me from places I can't see. And sometimes—" She hesitated, glancing between Erik and Astrid as if uncertain whether she should continue. "Sometimes what, child?" Astrid prompted gently. "Sometimes I can almost understand what they're saying, as if they're trying to teach me something important, but I wake up before I can learn it properly." Brynja's eyes were distant, focused on something beyond the visible world. "Do you think the old blood really remembers, Papa? Do you think it calls to those who carry it?" Erik's throat closed completely. Here was his daughter, innocently revealing the very gifts that made her such a deadly threat to their people's survival. The dreams she described were the first stirrings of her true power, visions from the realm between worlds that only the bridgewalkers could access. In time, if she were allowed to live, those dreams would become waking experiences, and her ability to step between realms would manifest fully. It was exactly what Harald and his priests feared most. Exactly what they would kill to prevent. "The old blood remembers many things," Erik said finally, his voice rough with emotion he tried to conceal. "But some memories are too dangerous for the world we live in now." Brynja nodded solemnly, as if she understood more than her years should allow. "Is that why you sometimes look sad when you watch me? Because you remember dangerous things too?" The innocent perception in her question nearly broke Erik's composure entirely. How could someone so young see so clearly into the hearts of others? How could she sense the burden he carried while remaining oblivious to the immediate danger that surrounded her? "Come," Astrid said, rising from her own resting spot. "We should reach the flower meadows before the sun begins to sink. The light will be perfect for gathering the best blooms." They resumed their climb, following the ancient path that their ancestors had worn smooth with countless pilgrimages to the sacred heights. Soon the trees began to thin, and the sound of wind-carved stone grew, louder as they approached the cliff edges where the land dropped. Away into the churning waters of the fjord, far below, the flower meadows spread before them like a tapestry woven from every color of spring. Purple starflowers and golden windwells, white mountain daisies and red cliff roses that bloomed only in this high, wild place. Brynja gasped with delight and immediately began picking her way among the blossoms, her earlier solemnity forgotten in the face of such natural beauty. "These will make the most wonderful garlands," she called back to them, already beginning to fill her basket with the choicest flowers. "Oh, and look at these tiny blue ones. I've never seen anything so perfect." Erik watched her move among the flowers like a spirit of spring herself, her auburn hair catching the sunlight and her face radiant with pure joy. This was how he wanted to remember her, not as the political necessity she had become, But as the miracle of light and laughter she had always been to him. The spot, Astrid murmured beside him, nodding toward a section of the meadow that ended in a rocky ledge overlooking the deepest part of the fjord. There, where the starflowers grow thickest. She'll want to gather them, and the edge is... She didn't finish the sentence, but Erik understood. The edge was sheer, unforgiving, and far enough above the water that no one could survive the fall. Erik's hand moved unconsciously to the poison vial hidden beneath his shirt. Soon now, very soon, he would call Brynja over to look at some particularly beautiful flower near the cliff's edge. He would offer her water from his flask, water that had been tainted with Astrid's sleeping draught. And when the drug took hold, when she slumped unconscious in his arms, he would complete the terrible arithmetic of love and duty that had brought them to this place. "Papa, come and see." Brynja's voice carried pure delight as she knelt beside a patch of the blue flowers that had captured her attention. "They're like tiny pieces of the sky that fell to earth." Erik walked toward his daughter on unsteady legs, knowing that each step brought him closer to the moment when he would have to choose between the child he loved and the people he was sworn to protect. The poison vial seemed to burn against his chest, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the cries of ravens circling in the wind. The gods were watching. They would witness what he was about to do, and Erik could only pray they would understand the terrible necessity that drove him to it. The afternoon sun had begun its slow descent toward the western peaks, casting longer shadows across the flower meadow as Brynja worked with the focused determination that marked all her endeavors. Her basket was nearly full now, overflowing with the bright blooms she had gathered with such care. Purple star flowers and golden windwells, delicate white daisies, and the precious blue blossoms she had discovered near the cliff's edge, each one chosen for its particular beauty, each one destined to become part of a crown that would never be completed. Erik stood frozen in place, watching his daughter's innocent industry, while the weight of the poison vial pressed against his chest like a burning coal. The moment had come. He could delay no longer without arousing suspicion, could not retreat from the path that duty had set before his feet. Yet his hand trembled as he reached for the water flask at his belt, and his throat closed around the words he knew he must speak. "Brynja," he called, his voice somehow steady despite the storm raging in his heart. "Come and rest for a moment. The sun is warm, and you've been working so hard." She looked up from her gathering, her face flushed with exertion and bright with accomplishment. "Just a few more, Papa. There's a patch of the most beautiful star flowers right at the edge there, purple so deep it's almost black. I've never seen anything like them." Of course she would want the flowers that grew closest to danger. It was as if fate itself conspired to make this terrible deed seem inevitable, providing the very circumstances that would make her fall appear accidental to any who might investigate later. "Those can wait, little star. Come and drink some water first." Erik held up the flask, its contents sloshing innocently. Inside, clear water had been mixed with 3 drops of Astrid's sleeping potion, enough to bring unconsciousness within moments, enough to ensure that Brynja would know no fear or pain when the end came. Brynja set down her basket and skipped toward him, her trust absolute and unquestioning. How many times had she come to him this way when he called? How many times had she placed her small hand in his, confident that he would keep her safe from any harm the world might offer? "The flowers are even more beautiful than you described," she said, settling onto the soft grass beside him. "When we get home, I'm going to make crowns for everyone, you and Astrid, and even grumpy old Olaf. Wouldn't he look funny with flowers in his beard?" The image she painted, Olaf's weathered face framed by delicate blossoms, should have made Erik smile. Instead, it twisted in his chest like a blade, another reminder of the future that would never come to pass, the simple joys that would die with her on this clifftop meadow. "Here," Erik said, offering the flask. "You've been working hard in the sun. You need to stay strong for the climb back down." Brynja accepted the flask without hesitation, raising it toward her lips with the same trust she had shown him every day of her young life. Erik watched in horror and desperate hope as the metal touched her mouth. knowing that once she drank, there would be no turning back, no escape from the path they had chosen. But before the water could pass her lips, a sound echoed across the meadow that froze them both in place, the deep, resonant call of a war horn blown from somewhere far below. The sound rolled up from the valley like thunder, carrying with it a message that made Erik's blood turn to ice in his veins. Harald had come early. What was that? Brynja asked, lowering the flask as she turned toward the sound. It sounded like a war horn, Erik finished, his mind racing through the implications. If Harald had arrived ahead of schedule, if he was already in the settlement asking questions and demanding to see Brynja, another horn sounded, this one from a different direction, and then another. Not just one horn, but many, as if a great army had suddenly appeared in the valleys around Raven's Hollow. The sound struck a chill deeper than winter into Erik's bones as he realized what was happening. This was not Harald's promised delegation coming for a peaceful examination. This was an invasion force, arriving in overwhelming numbers to crush any resistance before it could form. Harald had never intended to give Erik the chance to comply with his demands. He had planned all along to simply take what he wanted by force. "Papa?" Brynja's voice was small now, uncertain. The trust in her eyes had given way to confusion, and the first stirrings of fear as the war horns continued to echo from the surrounding hills. What's happening? Why are there so many horns? Erik's hand moved instinctively to the sword at his side, though he knew that one man, no matter how skilled, could not stand against the force that Harald had apparently brought to bear. The realization struck him like a physical blow. All his careful planning, all his terrible sacrifice, had been rendered meaningless. Harald had never intended to give him the choice of surrender. He had come prepared for war. "We need to go back," Erik said, rising to his feet with sudden urgency. "Now the settlement, our people, but my flowers." Brynja protested, reaching for her basket. "I haven't finished gathering. Leave them!" Erik's voice cracked like a whip, sharper than he had ever spoken to her before. The war horns were growing louder, closer, and smoke was beginning to rise from the direction of the settlement. Not the clean smoke of cooking fires, but the black, acrid smoke of buildings set ablaze. Astrid had risen as well, her face pale with the understanding of what those horns meant. "Erik, if Harald has brought an army, if he's attacking the settlement directly, then we're already too late," Erik finished grimly. "But we have to try." As they began their desperate rush back down the mountain path, Erik's mind reeled with the bitter irony of their situation. He had been prepared to murder his own daughter to save his people from Harald's wrath, but Harald had never intended to show mercy regardless of what Erik chose to do. The war horns had revealed the true scope of the threat they faced, not a demand for compliance, but a calculated campaign of annihilation. The poison flask still hung heavy at Erik's side, its terrible purpose now forgotten in the face of a more immediate catastrophe. Behind them, the flower meadow lay peaceful and undisturbed. Brynja's gathering basket abandoned among the blooms that would wither and die with no one to tend them. But ahead of them, down the winding mountain path, the smoke of burning buildings rose like funeral pyres into the afternoon sky, and the sound of war horns promised only destruction for everything Erik had sworn to protect. They had descended perhaps halfway down the mountain path when the sound of heavy footsteps and clashing metal reached their ears. Not from the direction of the burning settlement below, but from the path ahead of them. Erik raised his hand, bringing their desperate flight to an immediate halt as he strained to identify the source of the approaching noise. Through the trees came the unmistakable rhythm of armed men moving in formation, their weapons and armor creating a metallic symphony that spoke of professional soldiers rather than the farmers and fishermen who made up Raven's Hollow's modest defenses. Erik's hand moved to his sword hilt as he realized the terrible truth. Harald had not merely arrived early, he had surrounded the entire area, cutting off all possible escape routes from the sacred cliffs. "This way," Erik whispered urgently, pulling Brynja off the main path and into the dense undergrowth that clothed the mountainside. Astrid followed without question, her face grim with the understanding that they were now trapped between Harald's forces and the sheer drop of the cliff face behind them. They pushed through the tangled branches and moss-covered rocks, seeking some hidden path or cave that might offer concealment until the immediate danger passed. Brynja's blue dress caught on thorns, and her breathing came quick with exertion and fear, but she made no complaint as they fought their way through the wilderness. The sound of soldiers grew closer, accompanied now by voices calling orders in the harsh dialect of the eastern settlements. "Search every path, every cave, every hiding place," came a voice that Erik recognized with a chill of horror. Harald Bloodaxe himself, leading the hunt personally. The child must not escape. Everything depends on finding her alive. Erik pulled Brynja closer, pressing a finger to his lips to ensure her silence. Why was Harald so desperate to capture her alive? If his goal was simply to eliminate the threat of forbidden bloodlines, death would serve that purpose just as well as capture. The intensity of the search suggested something more complex, more dangerous than simple purification. A crashing of branches announced the approach of searchers, and Erik caught a glimpse of mail-clad warriors moving through the trees with the systematic thoroughness of men who knew their business. There was nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide. In moments they would be discovered, but as despair began to settle over Erik's heart, the forest around them suddenly went still. Not the natural quiet of woodland creatures sensing danger, but an absolute silence that seemed to press against the ears like a physical weight. The very air grew thick, charged with an energy that made the hair on Erik's arms stand upright. Brynja gasped softly beside him, her eyes wide with an expression Erik had never seen before, not fear, but recognition. A strange light seemed to emanate from her skin, faint but growing stronger with each passing moment. The pendant at her throat, the whalebone charm her mother had given her, began to glow with its own inner radiance. "The between place," Brynja whispered, her voice carrying an odd resonance, as if she spoke from a great distance. "The forest that isn't quite real. I know this feeling from my dreams." The world around them began to shift and blur, colors bleeding into one another like paint in the rain. The solid earth beneath their feet felt suddenly insubstantial, and through the spaces between the trees, Erik caught glimpses of another landscape entirely, one where the sun stood at a different angle and the very air hummed with ancient power. "What's happening?" Astrid breathed, her voice tight with fear and wonder in equal measure. "She's manifesting," Erik realized with a mixture of awe and terror. The stress, the danger, it's awakening her true gifts. Brynja stood at the center of the phenomenon, her 8-year-old form somehow radiating a presence far larger and older than her physical body. When she spoke again, her voice carried harmonics that seemed to come from the earth itself. "I can see them," she said, her gaze fixed on something beyond the visible world. "The old kings, the bridge-walkers who came before, they're showing me the paths between realms, the ways that have been forgotten by the living world." Around them, the searching soldiers called to one another in confusion. Their voices seemed to come from very far away, as if filtered through layers of reality that had suddenly interposed themselves between the hunters and their prey. "The child was here. I saw her tracks in the mud," came Harald's voice, distorted and strange. "But the trail simply ends, as if she vanished into empty air." Because that was exactly what had happened, Erik realized. Brynja's awakening power had pulled them into the space between worlds, the realm that existed in the gaps and shadows of ordinary reality. Here, they were invisible to those who walked only in the mortal realm, protected by forces that predated the arrival of Christianity and the fear of the old bloodlines. But even as relief began to flood through Erik's heart, he understood that this manifestation of power came with its own terrible price. Brynja was no longer simply a child carrying dormant gifts. She had become exactly what Harald and his priests feared most, a bridge-walker awakened to her full potential. "Papa," Brynja said, turning to face him with eyes that now held depths of ancient knowledge, "I understand now why you brought me here, why you carried the sleeping draught." You thought you had to kill me to protect everyone else. The words struck Erik like physical blows. She knew. Somehow, in her awakening, she had gained access to his thoughts, his intentions, his terrible plan. The shame of it threatened to crush him completely. Brynja, he began. But she raised her small hand to silence him. You made the choice any father would make. Given impossible circumstances, she said, and her voice carried a compassion that seemed impossibly mature for her years. But the old blood doesn't die so easily. Papa, and there are other ways to protect the people we love. Through the shimmering barrier of between space, they could see Harald's men spreading out in their search, growing more frustrated and confused with each passing moment. The great warrior himself stood not 20 feet away, his scarred face twisted with rage at the apparent disappearance of his quarry. The settlement, Astrid whispered. What about our people? Even if we escape, Harald will take his anger out on them. Brynja nodded solemnly. I know, but the Bridgewalker's power isn't just for hiding, Astrid. It's for walking between what is and what could be, for changing the shape of reality itself. She closed her eyes and extended her hands, and the light emanating from her skin grew brighter. Erik felt a sensation like standing at the edge of a vast cliff, not of stone and earth, but of possibility itself. In that moment, he caught a glimpse of what his daughter truly was, not just a child with unusual gifts, but a conduit between realms, a living bridge connecting the world of mortals with powers that had shaped reality since the dawn of time. What are you doing? Erik asked, though part of him already understood. What the old kings did when their people were threatened, Brynja replied, her voice now carrying echoes of those ancient rulers who had once walked between worlds. I'm going to show Harald exactly what he's been hunting and why some bloodlines should never be challenged. The forest around them began to change, reality bending and shifting in response to Brynja's will. And for the first time since Harald's messenger had arrived at Raven's Hollow, Erik felt something other than despair filling his heart. His daughter was not the helpless victim he had believed her to be. She was something far more powerful, far more dangerous and infinitely more capable of protecting both herself and the people they loved. The hunt was about to become something very different than what Harald had planned. The between space held them suspended in a realm where time moved differently, where the urgent chaos of Harald's search party became distant and dreamlike. Erik watched his daughter with a mixture of awe and trepidation as she stood at the center of swirling energies that bent reality around her small form. This was power beyond anything he had imagined. Yet it emanated from the same child who had skipped through flower meadows just hours before. I can see the settlement, Brynja said. Her eyes focused on visions invisible to Erik and Astrid. Harald's men have surrounded it completely. They've taken hostages, women and children in the Great Hall, while the men are being held in the storage sheds near the harbor. Erik's blood ran cold. How many warriors did he bring? More than 50, Brynja replied, her voice carrying the certainty of direct observation across impossible distances. But Papa, they didn't come just to conquer. They brought chains, iron cages on wheels. This was never about purification through fire. Harald wants to take the old blood alive. The revelation struck Erik like a physical blow. Iron cages, the kind used to transport valuable prisoners across long distances. Harald's true plan was not to eliminate the forbidden bloodlines, but to capture and control them. The implications were staggering. He wants to harness the power, Astrid whispered, her weathered face pale with understanding. To turn the Bridgewalkers into weapons for his own use, Brynja nodded gravely. The old kings were not just wise rulers, they were conquerors who could reshape battlefields with thought alone. Harald believes that if he can control someone like me, he can expand his territory across all the northern lands, maybe even challenge the southern kingdoms. Erik felt a new kind of horror settling into his bones. His careful plan to sacrifice Brynja to save his people had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the threat they faced. Harald didn't want to destroy the old bloodlines. He wanted to enslave them, to turn their ancient gifts into tools of conquest and domination. Then we cannot allow him to succeed. Erik said, his voice carrying the steel of absolute determination. "Whatever the cost, whatever we must do, he cannot be allowed to capture you." "No," Brynja said simply, "he cannot." "But Papa, the solution isn't to run or hide or even to die. The old blood has slept for too long, allowed itself to be forgotten and feared. Perhaps it's time for the world to remember why the Bridgewalkers were once revered as the children of gods. Through the shimmering barrier that separated them from the mortal realm." They could see Harald's frustration mounting. The great warrior stood in the very spot where they had hidden, his scarred face twisted with rage, as his men reported their complete failure to find any trace of their quarry. She was here. Harald snarled, kicking at the disturbed earth where Brynja's footprints should have been visible. Children don't simply vanish into mist. Search again, tear apart every bush, overturn every stone. But his men were beginning to exchange nervous glances, their confident professionalism giving way to the superstitious fear that still lived in the hearts of even the most hardened warriors. They had seen the tracks end abruptly, had witnessed their quarry disappear without explanation. The old stories their grandmothers had told them about spirits and magic were beginning to seem less like folklore and more like warnings they should have heeded. "My lord," ventured one of the soldiers, a grizzled veteran whose nerve had carried him through countless battles. "Perhaps we should return to the settlement. If the child has some way of concealing herself, then we might be wasting time here while she escapes by another route." Harald's hand moved to his sword hilt with the speed of striking serpent. "Are you suggesting that a slip of a girl has powers beyond our ability to counter, Ragnar? Are you telling me that 50 armed warriors cannot capture one small child?" The soldier took a step back, but his expression remained troubled. "I'm telling you that things are happening here that don't follow the natural order. My men are getting nervous, and nervous soldiers make mistakes." It was true. Erik could see the growing unease among Harald's forces as they continued their fruitless search. These were hard men accustomed to dealing with enemies they could see and fight, not with mysteries that defied explanation. The longer Brynja remained invisible to them, the more their confidence would erode. "She's testing them," Erik realized, watching his daughter's serene concentration as she maintained their concealment. "Showing them that they're dealing with forces beyond their understanding." "More than that," Astrid added, her voice filled with growing comprehension. "She's giving them time to doubt, time to fear. Fear is the beginning of wisdom sometimes." But Brynja shook her head, her young face grave with burden beyond her years. "Fear alone won't stop Harald. He's come too far, invested too much in this plan to retreat now. And the people of Raven's Hollow will suffer for his stubbornness if I don't act soon." She raised her hands again, and the between space around them began to shift and flow like water given form. Through the transparent walls of their sanctuary, Erik could see new visions forming, not just the immediate scene of Harald's search, but glimpses of the settlement below, where their people waited in terror for their fate to be decided. In the great hall of Raven's Hollow, the women and children huddled together under the watchful eyes of Harald's guards. Erik recognized faces among them, Freydis with her mother, young Gunnar's twin boys clinging to their grandmother, all the innocent lives that had become pawns in Harald's game of power and conquest. Near the harbor, the men of the settlement stood in chains, their faces bearing the marks of resistance that had been brutally suppressed. Olaf was among them, his weathered features set in the stoic expression of a man prepared to die before yielding. But even his legendary stubbornness would not protect him if Harald decided to make examples of those who had dared oppose him. "How long do we have?" Erik asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Harald left orders," Brynja replied, her voice distant as she observed events across impossible distances. "If his search party doesn't return with me by sunset, his men are to begin executing hostages, one every hour until I surrender myself." The sun was already well past its zenith, casting longer shadows across the mountainside. Perhaps 3 hours remained before Harald's deadline. 3 hours to find a solution that could save both Brynja and the people of Raven's Hollow. There has to be another way. Erik said desperately. Some path that doesn't require you to sacrifice yourself or our people to die. Brynja turned to face him, and in her eyes he saw depths of knowledge and power that seemed impossibly ancient for someone so young. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that resonated through the between space, like the tolling of great bells. There is a way, Papa, but it requires me to become what Harald fears most, not a hidden threat to be captured and controlled, but a bridge-walker awakened to her full power. Standing openly in the light of day, she gestured toward the distant settlement, where smoke still rose from burning buildings, and Harald's banners fluttered in the afternoon breeze. He came here believing he could take the old blood through force and intimidation. He brought 50 warriors because he thought numbers would give him victory. But he doesn't understand what he's truly facing. What do you mean? Astrid asked, though Erik suspected he already knew the answer. I mean that Harald has never seen a bridge-walker in full manifestation, Brynja replied, her small form beginning to glow with increasing intensity. He's read the old stories, heard the legends, but he thinks they're exaggerations meant to frighten children. He's about to learn that some legends are understatements. The between space around them began to contract, reality reasserting itself as Brynja prepared to step back into the mortal realm. But this time, she would not return as a frightened child fleeing from superior force. She would return as something Harald had never imagined in his darkest nightmares, a bridge-walker awakened, angry and prepared to protect everything she held dear. When we return, Brynja said, her voice now carrying the authority of the ancient kings whose blood flowed in her veins, stay close to me. The power I'm about to unleash will reshape the very ground we stand on. I don't want you caught in the aftermath, Erik nodded, his hand moving instinctively to his sword hilt. Not because he expected to need it in conventional combat, but because some gestures of protection were too deeply ingrained to abandon, even when faced with powers that transcended ordinary understanding. Are you ready? Brynja asked, and for a moment she was both the 8-year-old child he had raised and the legendary figure she was becoming. Innocence and power combined in a way that was both beautiful and terrifying. Erik looked at his daughter, at the bridge-walker she had always been destined to become, and felt his heart fill with a pride so fierce it threatened to burn him alive. I'm ready, little star. Show them what the old blood truly means. Brynja smiled, and reality exploded around them like a flower blooming in reverse. The world snapped back into sharp focus with the violence of breaking glass. One moment Harald and his warriors were searching through empty forest, their voices echoing with frustration and growing fear. The next, they found themselves face to face with something that defied everything they thought they knew about power and possibility. Brynja stood in the center of the flower meadow, no longer concealed by the between space, but blazing with light that seemed to emanate from her very bones. The whalebone pendant at her throat had become a star of white fire, and her auburn hair moved in winds that touched nothing else in the surrounding landscape. She was still recognizably the 8-year-old child who had gathered flowers that morning, but she was also something infinitely more, a conduit between realms, a living bridge connecting the mortal world with forces that had shaped reality since the dawn of time. Harald Bloodaxe staggered backward, his scarred face going pale beneath his weathered tan. The great warrior who had conquered settlements across the northern territories, who had faced berserkers and sea kings and rival chieftains without flinching, found himself confronted with something that made his legendary courage falter like a candle in a hurricane. Impossible, he breathed, his hand moving instinctively to his sword hilt before stopping, paralyzed by the realization that steel would be useless against what stood before him. You wanted to find the old blood, Brynja said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate from the very earth beneath their feet. You searched for forbidden bloodlines to capture and control. Well, Harald Bloodaxe, you have found one. The light emanating from her small form intensified, and where it touched the ground, flowers began to bloom out of season. not the simple wildflowers of spring, but exotic blossoms that had never grown in mortal soil, the petals shimmering with colors that had no names in any human language. Harald's warriors fell back in disorder, their formation dissolving as trained soldiers were reduced to terrified men facing powers beyond their comprehension. Several dropped their weapons entirely, falling to their knees in the instinctive recognition that they stood before something divine. "The bridge walker," whispered Ragnar, the grizzled veteran who had urged caution earlier. "The child goddess of the old stories. We should not have come here, my lord. We should not have challenged the blood of kings." But Harald's initial shock was already hardening into the familiar patterns of conquest and domination that had driven his rise to power. Yes, the child possessed abilities beyond anything he had imagined, but that only made her more valuable, not less. If he could find a way to control her, to harness her power for his own purposes, then the northern kingdoms would be merely the beginning of his empire. "Surround her," Harald commanded, his voice cutting through his men's fear with the authority of absolute command. "Carefully, she's more dangerous than we thought, but she's still just a child. She can be taken." Erik stepped forward, placing himself between Harald's advancing warriors and his daughter. His own sword was in his hand now, though he understood it would be of little use against 50 armed men. But sometimes a man stood not because he could win, but because standing was the only choice that left his honor intact. "You will not touch her," Erik declared, his voice carrying the authority of generations of chieftains who had ruled these lands. "I am Erik Ironhand, and this is my daughter. Any man who would harm her must first go through me." Harald laughed, a sound like winter wind across barren stone. Erik Ironhand, the mighty chieftain who couldn't even protect his own settlement. "Your people are in chains, your hall burns, and you think you can stand against me. You and what army?" "This army!" came a voice from the forest behind them. From between the trees stepped a figure that made even Harald's hardened warriors gasp in recognition and terror. 7 feet tall and broad as an oak tree, with arms like tree trunks and a beard the color of autumn leaves, the man who emerged from the forest was a legend given flesh. His skin bore the ritual scars of a dozen battles, and his eyes held the cold blue fire of the northern seas. Halvar the berserker had arrived. "I heard the war horns," Halvar said simply, his voice carrying the rumble of distant avalanches. "I came to see what fool had dared to bring war to these sacred mountains." Harald's face went ashen. Every warrior in the northern territories knew the name of Halvar the berserker, the giant who had carved his legend in blood across battlefields from the frozen wastes to the southern kingdoms. It was said that he had single-handedly held the pass at Thornbridge against 200 enemy warriors, that he had wrestled sea serpents in the deepest parts of the ocean, that the gods themselves had blessed him with strength beyond mortal understanding. "You," Harald whispered, his hand trembling slightly on his sword hilt. "But the stories said you had disappeared, that you sought only peace in your final years." Halvar's laugh was like boulders grinding together. "Peace? There is no peace for those who threaten children, Harald Bloodaxe. And this particular child—" His eyes moved to Brynja, and his granite features softened with something approaching wonder. "This child is under my protection." The silence that followed Halvar's declaration stretched taut as a bowstring, broken only by the whisper of wind through the pines and the distant cry of ravens circling overhead. Harald's warriors had spread into a rough semicircle, but their usual confidence had evaporated in the face of the legendary berserker, whose very presence seemed to make the air itself grow heavier. "You claim to protect her," Harald said, fighting to keep his voice steady despite the magnitude of the forces arrayed against him. "But do you know what she truly is? Do you understand the power that flows in her veins?" Halvar's smile was like watching a mountain crack. "I know exactly what she is, Harald. The question is, do you?" Before Harald could respond, Brynja stepped forward, the light emanating from her small form pulsing like a heartbeat. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of ancient kings and the wisdom of ages beyond counting. "He knows only what his greed allows him to see," she said, her gaze fixed on Harold with the intensity of summer lightning. He sees power as something to be taken, controlled, bent to his will. But the old blood does not work that way. She raised her hands, and the very air around them began to shimmer and bend. The flower meadow became something more than mortal earth, a place where the barriers between realms grew thin and permeable. Through the shifting veils of reality, glimpses of other worlds became visible, vast forests under alien stars, cities of crystal and light, oceans that burned with their own inner fire. This is what you sought to capture, Brynja continued, her form now seeming to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. This is what you thought you could chain and command. The Bridgewalker's gift is not a weapon to be wielded, Harold Bloodaxe. It is a responsibility to guard the passages between what is and what could be. Harold's warriors were backing away now, their formation completely broken as terror overcame training. But Harold himself stood firm, his ambition proving stronger than his fear. If anything, the display of power only inflamed his desire to possess it. Responsibility, he spat. Pretty words from a child who doesn't understand the realities of power. You speak of guarding passages, I speak of conquering kingdoms. With your gifts under my command, I could reshape the very foundations of the world. No, Halvar said quietly, stepping forward with the inexorable movement of an avalanche. You could not. What happened next would be spoken of in hushed whispers around countless hearths for generations to come. Harold, in his desperation and greed, drew his sword and lunged forward, not at the towering berserker who blocked his path, but at the child who blazed with impossible light. He made it exactly 3 steps before Halvar's massive hand closed. Around his throat, the great warrior who had conquered settlements across the northern territories, who had struck fear into the hearts of his enemies for more than 20 years, found himself lifted from the ground as easily as a child might lift a doll. Halvar's grip was not crushing, not yet, but it contained the promise of strength that could snap Harold's neck like a twig. You would strike at a child under my protection, Halvar rumbled, his voice carrying the deep fury of winter storms. You would raise your hand against the last of the Bridgewalker bloodline. For these crimes, Harold Bloodaxe, you have earned death. But before Halvar could complete his terrible justice, Brynja's voice cut through the tension like a sword through silk. Wait, the berserker paused, his granite features creasing in confusion. Child, this man sought to capture you, to use your gifts for his own dark purposes. He threatens not just you, but everyone who carries the old blood. I know, Brynja replied, her voice carrying a sadness that seemed far too deep for her young years. But death is not the only answer to the problems he represents. There are other ways to ensure he can never threaten the old bloodlines again. She stepped closer, and as she did, the light emanating from her form shifted and changed. No longer the pure white radiance of divine power. It now carried swirls of darker colors, deep purples and midnight blues, colors that spoke of mysteries best left unexplored. You wanted to see the full extent of Bridgewalker power, she said to Harold, whose face had gone grey with terror as he hung suspended in Halvar's grip. You wanted to understand what you sought to control. Very well. Let me show you. Brynja placed her small hand on Harold's forehead, and the great warrior's eyes rolled back until only the whites were visible. His body went rigid, and from his throat came a sound that was neither scream nor moan, but something far more primal, the sound of a mind touching truths too vast and terrible for mortal comprehension. What are you doing to him? Erik asked, though part of him already understood. Showing him the spaces between worlds, Brynja replied. The realm where the Bridgewalkers truly dwell. He wanted to command such power. Now he can experience it firsthand. He will see what lies beyond the mortal realm, what forces guard the passages between what is and what could be. Harold's body began to convulse, and tears of blood ran down his cheeks, as his mind was forced to perceive realities it was never meant to comprehend. He will live, Brynja said quietly, but he will never again be the man who came here seeking to capture gods. The sun touched the western peaks as Halvar gently lowered Harald's trembling form to the flower-strewn ground. The once mighty conqueror lay curled in upon himself like a child, his eyes staring at visions that would haunt him for whatever remained of his days. The touch of the Between Realms had burned away his ambition, his cruelty, his driving need to possess and control. What remained was barely recognizable as the man who had arrived with 50 warriors to capture a child. Will he recover? Erik asked, though he found himself uncertain whether he hoped for yes or no. Brynja knelt beside Harald's shaking form, her young face grave with the weight of what she had done. The divine light had faded from her skin, but the ancient wisdom remained in her eyes, the look of someone who had seen too much, understood too deeply. "His mind will heal in time," she said quietly, "but he will never again be able to think of power as something to be seized and hoarded. He has seen the true nature of the forces that shape reality. Papa, that knowledge changes a person in ways that can never be undone." Halvar stood watching the broken warrior with an expression that mixed satisfaction with something approaching pity. "His army will need new leadership. Warriors like these don't simply disappear when their commander falls. They find new masters, new purposes." "No," Brynja said, rising to her feet with a decisiveness that seemed startling in someone so young. "They will return to their homes. They will lay down their weapons and find honest work, fishing, farming, crafting." The touch of between space reached further than just Harald. Every man who witnessed what happened here today has felt the edges of that vast reality. They understand now that some forces should never be challenged. Through the trees, they could see Harald's warriors beginning to move, not with the disciplined formation of a conquering army, but with the uncertain steps of men whose world had been fundamentally changed. They helped their stricken leader to his feet and began the long journey back down the mountain path, their weapons abandoned among the flowers where they had fallen. "And our people?" Erik asked. "The hostages, the settlement?" Brynja smiled, and for a moment she was simply a child again, bright with the joy of bringing good news to someone she loved. "Free, Papa." The moment Harald's mind touched the Between Realms, his connection to his army was severed. His men felt the breaking of that bond, felt the fear and confusion that came with it. They released the prisoners and withdrew to the harbor, where they wait now for their leader's return. The relief that flooded through Erik's heart was so intense, it nearly brought him to his knees. His people were safe. The settlement would endure. The terrible choice he had almost made, the poison that still hung unused at his belt, had proven unnecessary in the end. But as the immediate crisis passed, other questions began to surface. Brynja's power had awakened fully now, blazing forth in a display that had been witnessed by dozens of Harald's warriors. Word would spread, stories would be told, and soon the entire world would know that the Bridgewalker bloodline still lived. "They will come again," Erik said, voicing the fear that gnawed at his heart. "Others like Harald, or the Christian priests, or ambitious kings from distant lands. They will hear the stories and seek to capture or destroy you." Halvar's laughter rumbled through the afternoon air like distant thunder. "Let them come. They will find the child is no longer defenseless, and she is no longer alone." Brynja looked up at the massive berserker with an expression of curious affection. "You've been watching over me for a long time, haven't you? Even before today." "Since the night you were born," Halvar confirmed. "I felt the awakening of your power across the leagues that separated us, felt the old blood stirring for the first time in generations. I knew that one day forces would arise to threaten what you represent. I've spent 8 years drawing closer, waiting for the moment when my protection would be needed." "But why?" Erik asked. "You could have lived in peace, could have avoided this conflict entirely." Halvar's granite features softened with something approaching tenderness as he looked down at Brynja. "Because some things are worth protecting, Erik Ironhand. Some bloodlines are too precious to let fade from the world. And because—" He paused, seeming to struggle with words that came hard to a man more accustomed to action than speech. "Because I have seen too much darkness in my years of war. Here in this child is a light that could guide the world towards something better. Brynja reached up and took Halvar's massive hand in her small one. And the contrast between them, the ancient warrior and the young bridge walker, somehow seemed perfectly natural, as if they had always been meant to stand together. "What happens now?" Astrid asked, speaking for the first time since the confrontation had begun. The wise woman's face showed the exhaustion of someone who had lived through events that would reshape her understanding of the world. "Now we go home," Brynja said simply. "We tend to the wounded, rebuild what was burned, and continue the work of living. But things will be different, Papa. I cannot hide what I am anymore, cannot pretend to be just another child gathering flowers in the meadow." Erik nodded, understanding flowing through him like cool water. His daughter would never again be the innocent girl who had skipped ahead of him on the mountain path. The awakening of her power had changed her irrevocably, adding layers of knowledge and responsibility that would shape the rest of her days. But she was still his daughter, still the light that had filled his world since the moment of her birth. And now, with Halvar's strength to protect her and her own awakened gifts to defend those she loved, perhaps she could find a way to live safely in a world that would always view her with a mixture of awe and fear. "Come then," Erik said, offering his hand to the child who was no longer quite a child. "Let us go home and begin the work of building a future worthy of the Bridgewalker's return." Together, the unlikely family, a chieftain, a berserker, a wise woman, and a bridgewalker, began their descent toward Raven's Hollow, where the people they had saved waited to welcome them home.